And my favorite homily from for the Feast of the Annunciation comes from a 12th century Cistercian named Guirac of Igny. He was a contemporary of Bernard of Clairvaux, and he was preaching to his monks on the Feast of the Annunciation, and he said to them in great detail, it's a long sermon, "We are all, and you are all, mothers of God. Just like Mary, you too have to be open to hear the word, to have the word implanted in you." And then he goes in great detail about how it's nurtured so that it can be born into the world through you. So here we are, being mothers of God with Mary today. So I'm pleased about that. As Father Ed suggested, this particular take on the Catholic imagination and Mary comes out of a larger pilgrimage project that I did a number of years ago. It took me about 8 years to do it, in which I peregrinated the LA diocese. And why LA? Partly because I was born and raised in LA. Also, it is the world's largest diocese and the world's most diverse diocese. I know there are a lot of very diverse dioceses on the East Coast, but LA, in fact, just given its sheer size and numbers, the archdiocese covers 8,762 square miles. It serves over 5 million Catholics. It has 287 parishes in 120 cities, and it holds celebrations in 80 different languages. So it's a remarkable place to actually experience the world church. And this project that I wanted to do on Mary was part of homecoming. I've lived in Omaha, Nebraska now and teach at Creighton University for the last 25 years. And I needed to go home and do a project there and to discover not only the incredible richness of Los Angeles, which is a daunting city in many ways, but also to understand this very complex global community of which I am a part. And Mary became the focal point of my peregrinations. People from all ends of the theological spectrum, from all different kinds of cultures, everything. I simply sought out Mary in all of her guises, in all of her spaces, in all of her celebrations. So what you're going to see here, obviously these were my choices. This was my decision. The book, which is the larger exploration of the pilgrimage, was my interpretation of what happened. But I took with me, after I'd done all of my research and went back to places, an Omaha photographer, Dorothy Tuma. So these photographs are actually her photographs that she did. You will be aware that I am going to present a lot of different kinds of art. This is not, a presentation of all the exciting new kind of interpretations of Mary that are there. There are some, obviously, this is the Lady of the Angels from the cathedral in Los Angeles. There's some beautiful art in LA. But I was more interested in how people experience her and where people experience her. So there's everything from folk art to kind of stereotypic, Pastor of Paris things to some beautiful stained glass, all, historical stuff, contemporary things, mass-produced things. But what I was interested in is Mary, and then coming to see what the Catholic imagination, how it is expressed in her. So this is what I'm doing here. Make sure I gotta get, okay, this is La Placita. I'm not sure the color is as good as it should be, but it's in many ways, the mother church. Los Angeles is not technically the city of the angels. It's the city of Our Lady of the Angels. The village was originally entitled the Village of the Queen of the Angels, and the angels sort of stand in for her in common discourse, but it doesn't negate the fact that the city really belongs to her. And she is actually a mosaic copy of one in Assisi, of obviously the Annunciation. It's on the frontispiece of La Placita, the little city. What one realizes first in LA that there are myriad Marys. She's present in her dogmatic form. For instance, as the Immaculate Conception, but she's also appears in Scripture in the ways that she is venerated in private prayer. Her special feasts are marked, and she is the beloved patroness of myriad nations, ethnic groups, cultural and particular locales. I am certainly not the first scholar to have concerned myself with Mary or Mary in LA, but in the final analysis, my experience in LA talking to just all kinds of people, priests, deacons, members of rosary groups, sacristans, ladies who, just sitting in the pew, old people, young people, men, women, all different languages. I even had an amazing conversation with a Vietnamese Catholic who runs a rosary group, and I speak no Vietnamese and he spoke no English, but we had a great Marian conversation. It was terrific. So I'm certainly not the first person to think about her, and yet in the final analysis, really what has grounded me is Mary's devotees, those men and women in the Archdiocese with whom I've spoken and prayed. These people have been my best teachers. I am a scholar of spirituality, and so I align myself really with lived experience, especially the experience of people who struggle to live out of the part of themselves that yearns for ultimacy, and who are shaped and changed in the process. So I'm going to present Mary as an expression of the Catholic imagination. That there is such a thing as a Catholic imagination, I think or an imagination, we have to establish that. I think of the imagination as a central human capacity that is crucial to all kinds of perception. So we need our imaginations to think about what is familiar and to see what is unfamiliar, as well as we need our imaginations to interpret patterns beyond what we perceive, to grasp the depth and nuance that is present in things. And we also need the imagination to conceptualize the world as it is not yet. It's really important. So what we dream, what we imagine is not fantasy, but it's depth, completion, and fulfillment. And different communities really have different sort of imaginative lenses through which they view reality. And I think the Roman Catholic tradition is one of those communities. So I ended up highlighting 4 aspects of the Catholic imagination that I think are really manifested in a Marian mode here. So the first is a sacramental imagination. Basically what this means is that space and time open out into that which is infinite and eternal. A sacramental imagination also concedes the possibility that the created world, by analogy, gives expression to that which is uncreated. So this sacramental sensibility. Second, and this follows from the first one, I think the Catholic imagination is deeply visual and embodied. It emphasizes seeing. It's enacted in gesture, ritual, and performance. And I'll unpack all of these during this talk. Third, the Catholic imagination stresses both the common good, the universal, but also the particular. It's this interesting tension between the universal and the particular. And I think it's also saturated with irony and paradox. There's unity in diversity, hope within tragedy, grace in the midst of grief. And it is in the fine point of these tensions that I end up finding Mary poised. So let's do each of those and explore this a little bit from the Marian vantage point. So, on December 12th, the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the city of the Lady of the Angels is awash in flowers. The festivities begin at dawn with Las Mañanitas, that little morning ritual in which the Virgin, who is known as the dove, the beloved one, the white rose, she's wakened with tender songs. And during the day, churches are filled with people who travel on their knees the length of the aisles toward images of Our Lady of Guadalupe and her chosen one, Juan Diego, where they sit quietly in pews, breathing in her presence. Bouquets of roses adorn formal altars. There are makeshift altars everywhere. Nor is it only the feast day itself that is observed. In many parishes, there are preparatory novenas before Our Lady of Guadalupe, or there are triduums that precede the feast. Early December is really a profoundly sacred time in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Guadalupe is not the only virgin who commands her own sense of sacred time and space, sacramental sensibility. I've got several pictures here. There's some more. The entire diocese, this huge thing is absolutely awash in flowers and in celebrations and people. And she has many meetings, obviously. She's Mexico's Virgin. She's the Mestiza. She's 1,000 different things. But she is so palpable and present. But she's not the only Virgin who commands the attention of her people at singular times. So the Filipino communities have great devotion to their many miraculous virgins. Peña Francia and Perpetual Help have their own festivals. These are also very present, different festivals on the Eastern Rite churches. In August, the Feast of the Dormition, what we think of as the Feast of the Annunciation. In the village of El Segundo, which is not that far from Loyola Marymount, the Melkite and Russian Greek Catholic communities take to the streets, bearing the silver-framed icon of the Mother of God. In the same way, on Mother's Day in May, at the Chinese Catholic Center in downtown Chinatown, the Festival of Our Lady of China is celebrated. And on December 8th, the Archdiocese is alive with veneration of Vietnam's Our Lady of Lavang. This sacramental imagination assumes that the visible world can be an expression of a deeper, invisible reality that sustains us. So in addition to sacred times, there are set-aside sacred spaces created for the intense veneration of Mary. One example of this is the Guadalupe Sanctuary. It's an exquisite little jewel box of a church. It was founded in 1929. It's almost impossible to find. It's in a maze of one-way streets down in East LA. But everywhere, there she is. It is her space. She is on the altar. She stands alone among a sliver of a moon. Her black belt of pregnancy is visible beneath her prayer-folded hands. On the other side of this, another image of her in that same sanctuary, stories of her encounter with the Aztec peasant convert Juan Diego. It goes on and on. She is alive and well there. Nor is Guadalupe the only virgin to command her own spatial realm. So also in East LA, we have Our Lady of Maria de Talpa at Our Lady of the Rosary of Talpa. She's the patroness of Talpa de Allende in Jalisco. She has her own parish. It's also true, and this gets us to some interesting things here, that there's this amazing parish down near the law school, down near downtown. It's called Immaculate Conception Parish, and it has these unique windows. This is just one of them. Do I have all three, or do I have just the one? Oh, I only have the one. There's a whole series of apparition windows. So there's Guadalupe, there's miraculous medal, there's Lourdes, there's Fatima, there's, it goes on and on, there's Knock, anyway. But there are these astonishingly beautiful windows. So she has this, whatever you think about apparitions, this sanctuary, I think, celebrates the imaginative possibility that the material world is radically open to the realm of the divine. Similarly, scattered across the Archdiocese, I went the wrong way, sorry about that, are a series of black volcanic stone grottos that replicate the 19th century appearance of the Virgin Mary at Lourdes. This is an interesting story. These Lourdes grottos were constructed by a Japanese-American Catholic who had been incarcerated in the internment camps during World War II and who vowed to construct a Lourdes shrine each year after he gained his freedom. His name was Ryoko Fusokado. And this particular one is in Altadena, but there's one up in Camarillo at the seminary up there, and they're just really beautiful, beautiful pieces that he did. So the point here, in terms of the sacramental imagination, is not only the obvious one, that the Virgin Mary occupies large temporal and spatial swaths of Southern California. It also is to suggest the depth of the religious imagination that would recognize the power of sacred time and space. So these images are not simply illustrative or pedagogical or memorial, but this kind of sacramentality opens up the possibility of personal and communal transformation, healing, renewal. All of these things can be anticipated with contact with the sacred, and these spaces and these times allow that kind of transformative environment to be nurtured and to help and to work on people. Okay. An example, there's some interesting scholarly examples. I'm not to go into them here, but this is the Cuban patroness, Caridad del Cobre. She is the patroness of the Cuban people, and there's a fascinating study by Thomas Tweed of how her shrine, particularly in Miami, which is the center of her shrine, has created a place where the displaced people, that Cubans who have come from their homeland, express the attachment of immigrants to their natal landscape and who script a dramatic narrative in which Our Lady of Charity becomes the leading mythic character. And it's a communal, social, individual kind of transformative environment. It's also important to remember that Mary makes theological claims, and depending on when churches were built, you can see how, like around the time in the 50s, when you had the proclamation of the Assumption, you have a lot of churches and imagery that is dedicated to those. So here you have in Ventura, lovely. This is actually behind the altar. It's huge, big fresco. Beyond the sociological and psychological dimensions of the sacramental imagination, Marian devotions also make theological claims, and that claim, at the center of Catholicism, is profoundly incarnational. Thus, even as the divine and human are not seen as identical, the intuition is that one can know and experience something of the divine by attending to human experience, attending to the body, attending to materiality. Another way of describing this imaginative approach is to say, and this is, I love this, William Lynch, a Jesuit poet and died in the 50s, is to say that the infinite is encountered only in and through the finite. The infinite is encountered only in and through the finite. You can't leapfrog. I mean, that's just a deep intuition. So it's not simply times and places that are set aside to acknowledge the sacred reality, but that sacred presence cannot be experienced except in and through the material, the temporal, and the concrete. So this is one way. Obviously, there are other dimensions of the Catholic imagination, a more what you call a dialectical imagination, in which God is other, or the divine is utterly other. There's lots of ways of talking about that too. But certainly in terms of a lot of this Marian devotion, it's very analogical. It has to do with knowing the finite in and through the infinite. So, that was my incarnational moment there. There's another one. There's an Annunciation. These are up in these two particular stained glass pieces are up in the Camarillo Seminary, and they're from Ireland. They're just gorgeous pieces. Okay, so a visual and embodied imagination. On any given day during the year, men and women, young and old, can be found in the still, dim interiors of Catholic parishes throughout the LA Basin. It's still a diocese in which 99% of the churches are open during the day. Sometimes you have to know on a school day to go around the back of the school. The front gate might be open, but you can go around on the playground in the back church, or a side door is open. And people use the churches there. They engage in scheduled novenas of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. They do the Stations of the Cross. They rest quietly. They genuflect. They touch the feet of the statues. They prostrate themselves. They walk on their knees in gratitude and reparation and adoration. They turn the pages of devotional manuals. They finger rosary beads. They put small photographs out of their jacket pockets and press them into the base of a Pietà or an image of the Sorrowful Mother. They enact private and collective gestures, both small and expansive. Really, the Catholic imagination is quintessentially visual and fundamentally about embodied ritual. It is really a performative and practiced faith. It's not just a notional kind of faith. This is down at St. Cecilia's near University of Southern California, really interesting parish. I'll say something about it later, but you can see it's just a classic Pietà, right? But all the flowers, the teddy bear, the devotional things that people put there. It depends on the pastoral staff here. Oh, I love this one. It's really typical. This is up near some of the military bases on the coast of California, and people's beloved ones are put into the great framed pictures of Our Lady of Guadalupe or at her feet as protectress and as maternal presence to take care of the loved ones. It's not that Catholics don't affirm certain proposition and adhere to creeds. Certainly you're aware that we do. But really, scholars, and I agree with them, have claimed that historically and in the contemporary world, ritual practices both shape and reflect the Catholic imagination most clearly. And the Virgin Mary is really the focus of a vast number of these different formal and informal embodied rites. So on a Wednesday evening in summer, I go to Glendale. Oh, don't do that. Here we go. Okay. To Glendale, this is Holy Family Parish. And every Wednesday night, all over the diocese, there is a Mass and a novena to Our Lady of Perpetual Help that the Filipino communities attend. It's incredibly popular. The Mass itself has a focus, but afterwards, the Our Lady of Perpetual Help really is the devotional focus of that. We acknowledge her as a maternal refuge, as comfort in time of trial and respondent to our petitions, and our embodied participation in this rite is really central to Catholic identity, really. Lots of Marian celebrations that are performative take place in Los Angeles. For instance, there she is. Again, among the Filipino community, there's a wonderful Easter tradition of this salubong, I'm not sure where the accent goes. It involves a procession of life-size images of the risen Christ and his mother. So first you have the sorrowful mother and the risen Christ, and an Easter morning at dawn, the grieving mother, the statue, is carried to meet her triumphant son. So you have a statue of the risen Christ, which the men bring, and then the women bring this statue of the grieving mother, and her black veil of sorrow is stripped away and replaced by a white veil of joy. It's a wonderful, wonderful embodied, dramatic kind of presentation, which is very much a part. The children are all dressed as angels, and they sing, and the whole bit. It's great. So if the material world is the medium through which the immaterial is manifest, then it makes sense that the visual faculty should be privileged in the Catholic scheme of things. And I'm not the first person to argue this. So all of the statuary, other visual images in Catholic churches, right here in your own, you have, people may not see traditional statues here, but you're laden with visual symbolism in this place. And private devotional practice is very visual as well. These visual depictions, again, should not be construed primarily as either catechetical or pedagogical, because if you read anything about religious imagery and the scholarship on that, images are very powerful, and they elicit incredible human responses. People are aroused by them. They break images, they mutilate them, they go on journeys to them, they're calmed by them, stirred by them, incited to revolt by them. They are elevated by them, moved to the highest levels of empathy and fear. And somebody like the scholar David Morgan has described the lure of images and affirmed that the act of looking itself is formative. That's really part of this Catholic thing. So, I'm number 37. Oh, I have to keep going here. Gotta get you. Here we go with some of the. I'll get back to St. Cecilia's here in a second. This is out at a Passionist retreat house in Sierra Madre. Another one of these, this is the Salvadoran and Honduran Virgin, the ethnic, national identity. People bring, the candles, they make devotion to and under the statues of their particular patronesses. Here we go. Here's the Melkite Greek and Russian Greek Catholic Church, another, again, example of this visual dimension. One of the interesting pieces of a very visual tradition is the extent to which you can actually read the history of a parish, often by paying attention to its visual iconography. This is down near St. Cecilia's. It was a great big Lombard Romanesque style church that was built around 1920. It was then redecorated around 1940, and you have at the back a typical, this is the Marian statue, this is not the central piece. It's very Byzantine looking otherwise, but this is the Marian altar here. You have a fresco that illustrates the appearance of Our Lady to Bernadette Soubirous at Lourdes, which was a big devotion at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And it's found underneath a rather traditional European-style Mary, Our Lady of Grace, who's extended in welcome up at the top there. The altar below is crowded with a whole bunch of different artifacts. To one side is a white-mantled Our Lady of Fatima, which was really ubiquitous in the region in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, when she was implored to save the world through the conversion of Russia. And then there's a framed reproduction of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, which was originally promoted in the early 20th century through the Redemptorists, who went through a kind of a fiery preaching mission and set up all these indulgences and such for Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And at the center, which obscures the Lourdes fresco, is a glass cabinet that contains an image of Nuestra Senora de Guajila, which is recently brought from Oaxaca, Mexico, by a group of Indios who venerate this Virgin. And what's interesting about St. Cecilia, it's just a little side tack here, is that it's down in an area that's not residential really anymore, and so it's a huge big place, and it wasn't getting a lot of use. And the diocese, under Mahoney actually, was very creative about this, because they have all these other immigrant communities that are more recent, like this little group of Indios from Oaxaca, and they each have their own devotions and their own different African groups and stuff that haven't been here long enough to have their own parishes and their own neighborhoods. And so St. Cecilia has become a place where if you go around, there's all altars to all these different places, and the various communities have specified Sundays of a month. So you'll have the Guatemalans are there, on the third Sunday, and the Nigerians are on the fourth Sunday, and hundreds of thousands of people come out to these things. And so it's become this wonderful place where, again, this temporal and spatial recognition of the particularity of groups' Catholic identity is there. Okay, there she is. There's Guajila. She's a very unusual little, that's her. Visual imagery is central to the Catholic imagination, as are ritual gestures, processions, and rites. And as I have done my pilgrimage in LA, I've also had opportunity to encounter many followers who speak of her apparitions, both past and present. And, I had to do some deconstructive work on this. This is not something, that's part of my life particularly. But I've come to appreciate a number of things about this, that there's histories to these things, and one of the ways it's possible to think about, for instance, the appearance or the encounter with Our Lady of Guadalupe as an example of one of these appearances that we associate with Lourdes and Knock and all that. I was helped by Latino theologian Roberto Guazzetta, who describes the sacramental realism that is implicit in the kind of devotional practices that I experienced in LA. He asserts that popular religious practices embody an organic worldview in which the human person sees him or herself as part of a relational network and a temporal continuing that embraces all of reality, both material and spiritual, and that non-empirical reality is not dismissed as irrelevant, but is factored into daily life through religious ritual and prayer. And I had to rethink some of my own assumptions about the nature of time, space, visual imagery, and ritual practice, and to kind of surrender a little more to this sense of sacramental realism as experienced by many of the people I met in LA, both with sort of traditional European devotions as well as other kinds of appearances all over Latin America where she's recognized. So, here another Marian altar all over, all her different guises are present in most places. So finally, one more aspect of this imagination, attentive to the universal and the particular. So on December 12th at Dolores Mission, which is a Jesuit mission down in the barrios of East LA, this is the little sanctuary, I am visiting, and I am at a Guadalupe. It's December 12th. It's one of the feasts of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And I'm there with a whole raft of different people who are just sitting, waiting here with their looped ribbons of green and red paper, and the paraphernalia of Guadalupe. And I notice as the Mass is going to begin, there's an odd item on the steps right before the altar. And at first I can't figure out what it is. And it turns out to be a folded fabric. And during the homily, the young Jesuit pastor identifies this mysterious bundle. It contains the sole possessions of a young man who was found dead in the barrio just a few days before. He was undocumented. He apparently had arrived from south of the border not long before in search of work, and he had no papers, he had no history, and he had no name. And like so many desperate young people, he had apparently run afoul of someone or something in this neighborhood, which is gang-dominated. And the tiny bundle that contained everything that was found with the body was placed before the altar to honor this boy with his dreams that are common to any boy. And the pastor gave him the name Juan Diego, because Juan Diego of the Guadalupe story was, like him, a poor man who was marginalized by the society that had co-opted his native lands and faith. It was just one lovely little moment which really spoke to me of the emphasis on littleness and particularity that is so deep in the Catholic imagination. This is in a different place. It's, again, part of the Guadalupe. It's a tapestry of the Guadalupe story. The emphasis on littleness and particularity plays itself out in 100 ways in Catholic intellectual, social, and ecclesial life. The option for the poor, the moral principle of subsidiarity, a preference for the virtue and vows of simplicity, poverty, and humility, a sometimes guarded tolerance for local cultural expressions of faith, a concern for the marginalized, for the unborn, for the immigrant. And this emphasis is in tension often with the equally strong Catholic instinct for the common good and for common worship and for common defining statements of faith. So, nevertheless, the local, the limited, and the particular do have a special place in the Catholic imagination of things. On the one hand, while Mary is acknowledged by the vast majority of devotees I meet to be a universal figure, she is also intimately present to individuals and to particular communities. So the Vietnamese know her as Our Lady of Lavang. Our Lady of Lavang appeared first in Vietnam in the jungles in 1798 to offer solace and healing to those who were fleeing from persecution. To Polish Catholics, she is the Black Madonna of Czestochowa, who first came to them in the 14th century and later protected the monastery of the Bright Mount from the invading Swedes. Never thought of the Swedes as those who run around invading people, but there she is. The Lebanese Maronite Catholics claim intimacy with her because, according to Scripture, Jesus and his mother visited Lebanon during his public ministry. So the local and the particular are recognized as cherished by the Virgin, who spreads her sheltering mantle over all who turn to her. Obviously, you're all aware, and I think it got mentioned earlier today, this lowliness of Mary is very present in Scripture, in the Gospel of Luke. The Magnificat that she sings, or the Gospel writer has her proclaim, speaks of a kingdom vision that would upend all unjust social arrangements, dignify the marginalized. Devotees of miraculous virgins and those who see her in appearances or her encounters also are aware that, that it's the little and the lowly to who she appears. So you have Bernadette, the peasant girl at Lourdes, or the illiterate children at Fatima, or Juan Diego. These are the chosen people. They're the little people. They're the Anawim. At the same Dolores Mission, where that little satchel was present from the anonymous Juan Diego, there's one of my favorite images of the Virgin. This is painted by a Jesuit. It's Santa Maria del Camino. Maybe some of you know the Madonna della Strada, which is in Rome, which is the kind of image of Our Lady of the Way or Our Lady of the Road that Ignatius was fond of. Well, this is an LA version of this particular Santa Maria del Camino. She's here in the particular guise as a young Latina woman with her serape-slung infant. She's walking barefoot along the road. The skyline of downtown Los Angeles is behind her, as it is seen from the perspective of the barrio in East LA. And one of the interesting things is that where she has walked, the road is smooth. She's walking on the stones, but where she has walked are already smooth. She's really a celebration of the lowly, the little, and the particular, and its power in the Catholic imagination. It's also true that the Catholic imagination, I think, really is another group of images here, is saturated with paradox and irony. I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the Catholic imagination. It has a wonderful capacity to hold together irreconcilable opposites in a kind of paradoxical tension. Most obviously, Mary has emerged in differing ethnic and cultural constituencies with a face and a function that suits each group. So for the Korean and Chinese Catholics, whose originating cultures hold up progenitors and value progeny, Mary's motherhood is key. For the Benedictine monks at Valiermo, she is the contemplative, the archetype of the contemplative. She's the one whose ear and heart are open to receive the divine word. I quoted Guéric of Igny in the 12th century. She's still that. I've been to the Feast of the Annunciation up at Valiermo, the Benedictines up there, and they understand themselves as, she is the human person as it is open to the mystery of God with us, and all that means, and gestating and giving birth, becoming mothers of God. For Armenian Catholics who were fueled by memories of their cultural genocide at the hands of Turkey, they cherish her as Queen of Martyrs. And each Caribbean and Latin American nation and many of their cities each have their own miraculous image of the Virgin whose beloved story speaks of her preference for them and their particularity. So Mary adapts herself generously to her locale and to the aesthetic tastes of her local admirers, and she holds all these together, all these different peoples under the shelter of her cloak. It's really amazing. I mean, they all say, oh, you recognize her as Mary, but she's so available and so generous. Even more remarkably, her welcoming arms extend to embrace Los Angeles Catholics along the ideological and theological spectrums. And this is one of the things that was the most moving for me to experience. Clearly, for many of her marginalized, she creates an alternative world where human dignity is not tied to either economic or social standing. And often, this is not the image that goes with that, I'll go back there in a second. Often I have had this Mary model of liberation held up to me by progressive Catholics, as she should be, the mother who advocates for her disappeared and abused children, who's not afraid to confront the powerful and upend the status quo. At the same time, I've talked to people and pastoral staff and people in the pews and whatever who view her more as a protector of a world that those progressive Catholics might not recognize. She's a fierce defender of traditional piety. She's a critic of secularism. She is a bulwark against secularism and the decadence of the modern world. In some cases, she's often the harbinger of a wrath that will befall a sinful world. She's a warrior and a boundary keeper par excellence. Most touchingly, however, I have, here we go, discovered places in which Mary herself has played a creative role of peacemaker amidst her divided cultural constituencies. Obviously, there is Guadalupe. I should have gone back to Guadalupe here. Who theologian Virgil Elizondo describes her as the new creation who emerged from the encounter of the European and the indigenous cultures of Mexico. She's a mestiza who is neither an Indian goddess nor a European Madonna. And she's the mother of the generations to come who will synthesize the richness from their parent cultures and construct a society in which the barriers between people are broken down. So she's, on the one hand, Guadalupe can be seen in herself as a reconciler. But there's other instances that are really interesting that I had the experience of encountering. I went to this parish in Altadena called Sacred Heart, and it's a very diverse community, like a lot of them in LA, where there are inherent tensions, that you have the African-American Mass, and you have the Anglo Mass, and you have the Spanish Masses, and you have a Vietnamese Mass, and you have, and actually on the street, a lot of these groups are not friendly to one another. I mean, you can have gang warfare, you can have difficulties of all kinds. And a young pastor came into the community. He's a young Filipino fellow who I very quickly figured is going to go places in LA. But he came in and he actually asked people what they wanted, which was a great question to ask a parish. And they said, we have these divided communities. What do we do? And so he created this Marian Congress, and he got all the parish involved. And all the disparate groups came together to pray multilingual rosaries. They heard these talks on Mary in various ways, and they brought all of their different images of the Virgin and their different stories, and they presented them. And so you had, Mary was the connector between all these people who were otherwise completely at odds with one another. It's also true that throughout the Archdiocese, there are other iconographical examples of her reconciling role. The light is not real good when you see it projected here, but this is Robert Graham's rendering of her at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels. She was self-consciously designed to be racially unidentifiable. She has features that could be Polynesian, that can be African American, that are Latino, that are Asian. She consciously was designed to reflect the extraordinary diversity of cultures in Los Angeles, and so she's present as a symbol of the whole of Los Angeles and its people. It's also true that I went to just a parish out in the valley, out in North Hills, and their name is Our Lady of Peace Parish. And a number of years before, they were kind of unhappy as a parish. They said, we're not, Our Lady of Lourdes, or we're not Our Lady of Guadalupe. We don't have a big feast, So they tried to not change the parish name, but research a little more Our Lady of Peace. And what they decided to do was to commission LA artist Lalo Garcia to create this wonderful fresco that's outdoors. It's on the playground in a kind of a big niche of Our Lady of Peace. Again, the Virgin's face reflects the varied populations that the church serves, a racially unidentified girl clothed in bright fabric with her upturned hands and a dove fluttering. She's really the common ground upon which this diversity of worlds meets. So this paradoxical Catholic imagination is of necessity, an ironic one, for it permits both joy and tragedy. Its fundamental aesthetic moves from grief and loss of innocence to consolation, forgiveness, and redemption. And God, the divine, is found most precisely in the ironic juxtaposition of hope and the experience of loss. So everywhere in the diocese, Our Lady of Sorrows, Dolores, is evident. At almost every turn on my pilgrimage road, I encountered her with her eyes upturned, weeping. She cradles the body of her dying son in the iconic Pietà. Shrouded in black, she presses her hands together in anguish. She swoons at the foot of the cross and bears her suffering in solitude. You can read these. Sometimes people read these images as, oh my goodness, this just justifies the old kind of, offer it up, suffering is good for the soul. That's not the way that people actually have a devotion to these things. People come to her, they migrate to her, they bring offerings and flowers, ex votos, crumpled photographs of loved ones. She's in solidarity with them. She is the one who knows. She's the one whose heart breaks when the son is lost. She's the one who, understands what it is to have a child who is, part of a gang. She's the one who understands what it is to live with suffering. And people really do migrate to her. These images point not merely to her solidarity with those who suffer, nor to her consoling maternal presence, but to the irony that even in the depths of sorrow, the mystery of joy is still incipient. There is really nothing glib about this. Our Lady of Sorrows in Los Angeles carries in her heart, and I mean this quite literally, the unbearable grief of countless losses that have been left at her feet. You really experience this when you pray with the communities that have deep devotion to her. So it's Good Friday, and I again go to Dolores Mission, which is this little tiny mission in the barrio, which I absolutely love. And there's a Pessime service. Up front on the tiny church, the altar has been removed, and this particular polychrome statue of the doleful, sorrowing mother stands in a pool of light. There are first a recitation of the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary, and then the young pastor begins a meditation on the weight of the sorrow that Mary carries. And he does this very dramatically and effectively. We're drawn into her grief with a first-person narrative, and eventually, after he finishes his meditation, we're all given these little sheets of paper and pencils, and we're invited to reflect on the burdens that weigh upon us. And we write them down, and then we all process up. There are somebody playing the guitars and such. And we bring them along with carnations to lay at the feet of Dolores. And as the service continues, community members are invited to stand up. And it's mostly the women who stand up. My boy has fallen in with bad men. My daughter is sick and dying. I go to the prison and visit my son. I don't know if he will come home. The drugs, they find our children even on the playground. In this Pessime service, in the presence of the sorrowing mother, there is no pain that is isolated, no sorrow that breaks the heart held alone, no grief so stinging that is not already known and born in this humble shelter in the barrio of East Los Angeles, born in the wisdom of those present and most generously by the sorrowing mother herself. In her, one can glimpse the ironic truth that grief can ultimately give way to joy. So this Mary that I encountered really occupies a very richly textured, imaginative space in the Catholic imagination in LA. She's at the center of time and space. She's the guardian of the common good, as well as of the marginalized, the local, the powerless. She's visualized and honored by embodied rituals that usher the faithful into a sacred encounter which can empower, transform, heal, and comfort. And she's the shared love of a widely diverse and often contentious community who find in her their common ground. So I just have a few comments. Again, that's Altadena Parish with all their different images that they brought from their homes of Mary. So just a very brief ending here. I came to think about her not only in these four modalities, but as the phrase le point vierge, the virgin point, continued to haunt me as I was doing this research. And I don't want to be misunderstood. The idea of virginity can get very, very oppressive in many ways. Mary would never wear patent leather shoes, the ultimate good girl kind of thing. But I think in its best sense, it's a stunningly fruitful spiritual metaphor. And even though it's been used oppressively sometimes to keep women in their place or to condemn bad women, I think that it needs to be opened up again. And the phrase le point vierge, I think, captures what I find in Mary. The phrase, I discovered it first in Thomas Merton, and he had taken it from the Islamic French scholar Louis Massignon, who himself had learned of the idea of le point vierge through his studies of a 10th century Sufi mystic of divine love. So all the way back to the 10th century mystic, Al-Hallaj taught that the virgin point was the secret place in the center of the human soul to which God alone has access. And this virgin point, or some people have called it a virgin heart, is the goal of the Sufi mystical process of removing the layers or veils from one's heart, a process that is accomplished through asceticism, meditation on the Quran, acts of charity, and so forth. So the idea of this point of the heart where removing the veils that cover it and all of, the false self, to use Merton's term. And Massignon picked up on this idea of Al-Hallaj's, and he used it in the context of interfaith encounter. He was a French Catholic who was an Islamicist, and he saw the need for cultivating a virgin heart as a prerequisite for encountering other religious traditions. What was needed, he said, was a complete reversal of attitudes toward other faiths. This is way back in, the middle of the 20th century. And Massignon wrote to Thomas Merton, and Thomas Merton also used the phrase le point vierge, and he expanded a little on it and used it in his own way. For him, the point vierge was a spiritual reality, a location, as it were, of the encounter of divine and human from which everything else has been emptied. It's a state of being where at the center of human nothingness, one finds the ultimate other, God, both the religious stranger and the divine other, God. So the virgin point is the in-betweenness that returns us to the fresh possibility of recreation, as well as an experience that takes us to the very edge of what is unknowable and unsayable. So it's both mystical and political. And I kept thinking of this phrase as I, even some of these most ordinary images of Mary. First of all, there are just a dizzying variety of Marys. And these multitudinous identities don't bother most people. So she really is a central, powerful, and integrating symbol in the very complex Catholic world. There are central Marian dogmas, obviously, and a long tradition of Marian reflection. And, these come down from the magisterium, and people, inhabit them. But in practice, these simply seem to fold into the various attributes and roles with which her faithful endow her. So this idea of the tolerance of holding together intention under one signifier, Mary, such a vast panoply of names, faces, qualities, capacities, and functions, is quintessentially Catholic. In this sense, then, she is within the faith community, I think, a point vierge, a liminal in-between reality where the diverse hopes and aspirations of so many different people converge. I, in my optimistic moments, see in her the creative potential of the collective Catholic imagination that while it continues to refine and clarify itself through structures and doctrines, also refuses to be reduced to those clarifications. It is alive, inbreaking, generous, and unpredictable. And Mary, she waltzes back and forth between the center to the periphery of the tradition and back again, choreographing a dance into which everybody is invited. And I see her this way. I also see her as a place where the other, the capital O, other, is truly encountered. And this really has been my experience on this LA pilgrimage. I think I first started to think of this when I came to North Hills and heard the story of the way the parish deliberated about how to deal with these different factions, and they had this wonderful multiracial fresco made. And then when I went to Altadena and heard about the Marian Congress, Mary is a reconciling symbol, not only expressing what people imagined and hoped for, she also was instrumental in bringing what was imagined into being. She actually facilitated the imagining that people had of the future. She became the common ground that enemies shared, the common ground of meeting and reconciliation. And for me, she really was a common ground, talking with not people only of different ethnic and cultural and language groups, but people who are in very different parts of the theological spectrum, and their experience of the Catholic Church is really different than mine, that we met there with Mary. And so it was this deeper level of encounter. It was deeply, deeply moving. There was something about the way my conversation partners described their relationship to her, no matter what they thought about other things. It was tender, poignant, hopeful, and there really was no reason why they should have been so forthcoming to me, so revealing of their love and the depths of their faith, except that their relationship to her was one of deep affection, and in me they recognized that similar affection. So people never spoke to me in a catechetical mode. They never talked to impress me, but they talked about their deepest longings and their greatest hopes. And she seemed to represent, or even more provocatively, to be present at some deep, resilient space in the human heart in which newness and possibility germinate. So beneath the veils that cover the heart, beneath the fears and views and ego-driven ideologies, I hope there is a space, a point vierge, a virgin space, not in the sense of ambiguity, nor pure because it denies the vagaries of the human heart, which is capable of cruelty and destruction, but a space so deep and so poised at the edge of unknowing and the unsayable that the outer layers that cover the heart are peeled away and yield to silence. This, I think, is a point where the stranger is encountered in the full mystery of otherness, a point where tensions meet and, while not resolved, still create new possibilities. This is the threshold where the divine other invites. At this point, the heart breaks open, and what remains is mystery, grace, forgiveness, reconciliation, hope, and beauty. Beauty, beauty, and more beauty. Thank you. I kind of went at you for a long time here, I'm sorry, but if anyone wants to entertain any thoughts or questions or additions, subtractions, multiplications that you'd like to, clarifications, yes.